I never thought seriously about leaving the United States. Katie and I have always had everything we needed until a few years ago, that is. And no, it wasn't the politics, although that entered my mind. In the end, it was two things. One, the cold weather. I'm tired of Chicago winters. Two, I tend to feel most alive, most myself when we are in Mexico. Maybe it's the people, or nature, or just the pace of life. What it's not for us is the economics, although who doesn't want to have a lower cost of living? I never planned on becoming a nomad, flitting around the globe, nor what my guest today would call a nomad capitalist. But maybe he has a point. Why not go where you're treated well, maybe pay a little less taxes or a lot, and build a business or even a well diversified life? Andrew Henderson lives by five magic words: go where you're treated best. He is the managing partner of Nomad Capitalist, which helps people find the best places to live, bank, invest, incorporate, start a business, hire, date, and more. After spending a decade visiting more than 100 countries and living in a dozen of them, Andrew has become an expert on the growing field of global citizenship. He's the author of Nomad Capitalist. Andrew Henderson, welcome to Earn and Invest. I want to go back to the moment that you are walking into the U.S. Embassy in Georgia, and I'm not talking about the state of Georgia, I'm talking about the country, and you were about to renounce your U.S. citizenship. Tell me what was going through your head at the time.
I look at it as a breakup that you've had a long-term relationship, you've had the highs, you have the lows, and every time you think about ending the relationship, you think, is this the right thing? It's comfortable. You have reasons to defend the relationship. You have kind of the knee-jerk reactions to defend the relationship. But at the end of the day, you feel like this is not a relationship that I belong in. And so, yeah, it's been a little over 5 years when I walked into the U.S. Embassy. I had thought about it numerous times. In fact, I was thinking about it this morning. When I was 13 years old, my father was, he would bring home the Wall Street Journal and he'd read various things. And he told me, oh, U.S. citizens have to pay tax no matter where they live, but you can make $62,000. This is like the late 90s. You can make $62,000 a year. And I said, Dad, I want to do better than make $62,000. And he did better than making $62,000. He was a successful guy, but he just figured, hey, what's so bad about it? And I remember that kind of offended me. I was always interested in traveling. I always wanted to travel the world. I wanted to live overseas from when I was 15 years old. And I just didn't feel aligned with the US. And when I started going other places, I felt more aligned. And so after years of living in those other places, I finally felt enough aligned as I walked in that day to where I have some misgivings about the US, the policies, some of the politicians, some of the people. But I feel like some of the anger and animosity of that caused me to leave, and you realize this isn't a good reason to leave, had left the system to where it was time to make a rational decision where you release what doesn't belong to you and you feel comfortable rather than doing it out of anger. And that's what I felt. And I remember when I walked out about half an hour later, it felt exactly like ending the relationship that has to end. You feel a little sad about it, but you walk out and ultimately you did the right thing.
So if we're going to continue the metaphor with the relationship, usually after a relationship ends, you tend to go back in your mind and really tear it apart and say, what worked, what didn't, why did I get to this point? Go back to childhood a little bit, because this seems like this was deeply ingrained in who you are. What do you think about the US just didn't fit you?
Well, I always wanted to travel. I felt people in the US, there's a certain insularity. I mean, I feel like people, when you start traveling, you go back and you talk to folks and they don't really understand the things that not only would someone, let's say, I have friends from Egypt or other countries like that they know they've got to get visas to go a lot of places. Whenever we hire someone from the West, they ask, why don't you have your live events? We had 500 people last year in Mexico. Why don't you do that in the United States? I said, because almost none of our staff could go without getting a visa. And they're like, no, but that's to live. You're just going. I'm like, no. Why do you think you don't see a million Bangladeshis in your neighborhood in the United States? Because they need visas and it's hard. And so I just kind of feel like there's this thing where once you start traveling, it's kind of hard to go back to this kind of isolated country. I don't agree with the politics. I mean, for me, I'm a pretty libertarian guy. And so a lot of people don't understand, why wouldn't you like Trump? Well, America first. I mean, America first. I think the United States always puts itself first. He makes some good points. You're paying for Germany and NATO, blah, 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 blah. But, you know, I looked at that as a guy like me who wants to live overseas. I'm already filing all the tax returns. I'm already doing all the legwork. It's going to be even worse. He's going to come down on people like me like a ton of bricks. And I wasn't entirely wrong. It wasn't Barack Obama or Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton who made life for expats more difficult. It was Donald Trump. And I predicted that as I remember sitting here in Malaysia watching him get inaugurated. I just think that the people, there's some great people, but by and large, people just aren't that educated. They're not that well traveled. I sat next to someone many years ago. I'm going to Oslo. Where are you going? Oslo, North New Jersey. Like, I mean, and is that a reason to give up your citizenship? No, it just didn't gel with me. Probably there was some reasons on the social side. I mean, I've never, I think I'm an interesting person. I've never had more difficulty meeting people in the United States. I meet people overseas. It's much easier. Women, friends, what have you. And I just think it was difficult. And probably there was some dynamics of the family. The family gave me permission to not live where they lived. It was not like stick around and take care of us. It was like, hey, you want to go somewhere else? Go ahead. We don't need to talk every week. Very Protestant, like, we're not living together. What do you want?
So let's talk about this a little bit. You knew, I think, at a fairly young age, this need to get out, this feeling that maybe the US didn't quite feel like you. Did you start building your career with that in mind? Like when you're looking at high school and college, were you like, I need to build some type of business or career path that'll allow me to travel the world?
I feel like probably starting at 16 or 17, like a lot of young men, probably got lost somewhere. And so I kept some of those thoughts, but I didn't put as much effort in high school. Didn't really want to go to university, but felt compelled because all my friends were going to great universities. They were all very smart, and I'll go somewhere. Never really get into university. Barely attended. Ended up leaving. Ended up starting a business. I think it had to hit me for real. Number one, to make enough money to be able to travel and say this actually is what I want. And number two, to end up paying a bunch of tax when you start making money and saying, this is pretty bad. Because I was a libertarian, as a kid, 15 years old. It's nice in theory. Oh, we should have lower taxes. Another thing, you're sending $50,000 to the government and it hurts. And you're saying, what am I getting for this? And so I think it all started to come together in my early 20s. I started traveling. I had a great interest in frontier markets, places like Cambodia. But I also, explored a lot of Europe. And so I think the more you did it, from early 20s, the more I realized this was for me. But I think there was probably a period where I did get off track and I had to learn the lesson for real rather than just learn the lesson theoretically. I look at these guys, we've had clients who are 21, 22, they're making millions of dollars. And I say, that's fantastic because I think I kind of missed a few years there that I should have been more productive.
What do you think got you back on track? Was it your first major travel, or was there something that caused it really to click in your head and you said, wait, I'm getting away from what I need to be doing?
I think to some extent, I probably became successful in business, 22, 23, I'd started something and I started making, decent money, six figures, whatever. And what, there was a certain amount of luck and just kind of like, I'm going to do this, and it just kind of worked out. And the more things work out, the more you kind of make note of, oh, this is what worked. And the more you kind of organize your life. When you're just starting, there's kind of a chaos to it. And as it got more and more organized, I think I felt more and more in touch with myself. Going to university and not really wanting to go to university, it just felt maybe out of order. And I didn't put in the effort. And there was something kind of missing. But when I started to click and started to make money, it's like, yeah, this is what to do. Let me refine this. I hope that makes sense.
Let's talk about when it started to click in your head, this idea of the Nomad Capitalist. So this is the name of your business. It's the book you wrote. It's really how you fashioned your life and now help other people live. When did you start realizing, oh, wait, this is not just something kind of I can do, but other people need help figuring this out?
I got the website Nomad Capitalist as I was selling my last business. I said a couple different things. I had a major business and I'd started a couple other smaller projects, and I was selling one of those smaller projects. And I said, you know what? I'm going to travel the world. I'm going to take some money that I have and I'm going to make some investments. Maybe I'll start some ventures. Maybe I'll, write some small checks to invest in startups in some of these places that are, the road less traveled, the Cambodias of the world, that kind of place, Eastern Europe. That was what I was interested in. And I said, actually, I wanted to do a show like yours. And I figured, hey, the best way to interview some of these big figures that will help me is I'll do a show. And my background was in broadcasting. I sold radio time. Basically, we were a market maker for radio infomercial time. And so I knew all these people, and I found this station in New York. Hey, will you run this show on Sunday? I'm going to make a 1 hour podcast. Will you run it in New York? Guy in Los Angeles. Will you run it in Los Angeles? And I went out and tried to get people on my show. And so I just put out content. I wrote a blog, I wrote an article every day. I did the podcast. I just put in a ton of content as I'm traveling around the world, as I'm meeting people, CEOs of banks and investors and everything else. And people just started reaching out. And it kind of took a life of its own. And I think I probably was telling the story about why I left. There was probably some confusion about why I left. I think probably I told myself it was more about finance because I was not self-aware enough back all those years ago to realize there were some deep hurts that propelled this. And so I was probably doing things differently than someone who is a bit more well-adjusted would do if they're moving to Dubai and want to make friends and have a nice life. But I think I just put out what I'm doing, and people started being interested. And when I said, hey, who wants some help? People responded. And I think the more we did that, the more we learned about what works and what doesn't work. And the more, I invested back into my own personal passports and residences and bank accounts. And we just, it snowballed from there.
I like this idea how you kind of said in the beginning, you convinced yourself it was really all about finances. And as you grew into the idea, you realized that it was partially finances, but a lot more. Explain for people what a nomad capitalist is. And you use the word capitalist there, but I always get the feeling like it's much broader than just what we do with our money or how we build businesses.
Well, I think it's nomad, which is someone who's constantly on the go. Now, I always said you can be a nomad capitalist and you can live in one place, but it's about my 5 magic words: go where you're treated best. What's the best place? And so for me, it was kind of hard to choose. I think I've probably figured out all the cities that I would like to spend time in at this point. And now I'm starting to really narrow down and probably going to focus on 2 or 3 main ones. But I liked a little bit of different places. And so for me, it was being kind of nomadic. For others, it might be I'm a nomad, but I just live in a different country. I live in Dubai full time. I live here in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia full time. I live in, whatever. I have 1 base, 2 bases. One guy had 8 different bases. He wanted to spend 6 weeks in 8 different places. And so you are moving to some extent, but you are a capitalist. You're not, and there's no judgment here, but you're not someone who wants to go to Bali and figure out I need $2,000 a month to live and then reverse engineer it from there. How little do I need to work to make $2,000 to live and drink smoothies and ride a bicycle and Instagram with orangutans? For me, it's about building businesses, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just not my thing. I like to work. I like to build businesses. I like to invest. I'm not as good of an investor as I am as an entrepreneur, but I find opportunities around the world. And so it's both of those things. You are in the world, again, whether you're in Dubai and you travel a little bit, or whether you're always traveling and you're seeing opportunities to make money and to better society with your investments and with your businesses. It's those 2 things put together.
I like this idea of go where you're treated best. And maybe this speaks to the nomadic part of it. Part of the problem with that, right, is that you're treated best in different ways in different places, right?
Yes.
So one place may have the best weather, another place may have the best banking, another place may have the best atmosphere to start a startup. Talk about that a little bit, because for you, at least when you began this journey, you really were very nomadic, right? You were traveling quite a bit.
Yes. All the time, nonstop, living out of a suitcase for some time, then got an apartment where I'm at now in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. And I was just kind of traveling from there, and ultimately decided, as you hired people around the world and opened offices and did business and, got different residence permits and citizenships by buying real estate around the world. Hey, I'll buy a house in Colombia and I'll get residence there and I'll pop in there every once in a while. So the network expanded, and so did the lifestyle. But if we go back to the relationship example, if you're going to be in a marriage, it better be a great marriage where every need you have is satisfied. And let's be honest, I don't think most people have that. Now, what my idea is that, the best place to bank probably for an entrepreneur who's not looking for hoity-toity banking, doesn't want to overpay, the best place is probably Singapore. Now, I don't think you should live in Singapore because if you can live anywhere you want, number one, are you going to hire Singaporeans? A lot of cultures, the time zone's bad. If you're dealing with North Americans, is the culture entirely aligned? You can probably hire people for somewhere, for a lower price, or, Europeans that, maybe are more culturally fit for the same price. You're going to buy a house. I have a house here. It costs less than $1 million. Big, beautiful, apartment. That in Singapore probably is $15 million in the same amazing location. So why? I don't want to be, a value investor. I don't want to waste money. So Singapore is a great place to bank. It's a great place potentially if you're buying dividend stocks. You're buying REITs. You have a good tax, very zero tax rate on things like dividends. It's a good place to park your wealth. And so I came up with the global citizen sandwich. Maybe I'll live in Kuala Lumpur. It's affordable, but it's very developed. We're pretty well developed. I'll keep my wealth in Singapore, and I'll make smaller frontier investments in a place like Cambodia or something like that. And so I'm in the middle of the sandwich because I'm getting the best value without sacrificing much in the way of lifestyle. Maybe not a lifestyle at all because Singapore is a bit more intense. Maybe you don't want that. But then I'm going up the chain for wealth management. Let the people in the intense city manage your wealth, and then go down the chain for places that are up and coming to get your bigger bets or the home runs potentially. And so you can do that anywhere in the world. But yeah, I mean, is Singapore the best place to mate your husband or your wife? Every place has something that it's good at. So why don't we just get into a marriage with every place just because we're born there or just because we're a citizen there? Let's take the best that every place has to offer and diversify.
I love this idea of diversification, but at some point, especially as you became more settled, you realized that it probably didn't make sense for you to be in every major city or, in a sense, to pursue every best thing where you're treated best because there were just so many possibilities. You pursued something called the trifecta strategy. Talk about what that is and why that worked for you.
So the idea is if you want to get the best of different cultures, you create a lifestyle where you live 4 months in 3 different places. I think I told myself it was more about finances. Unless, hey, I'm happy to enjoy the financial benefits. But for me, it was, I like spending time in Malaysia. I've got certain things that I love doing in Malaysia. And then, I get to Malaysia after a while. You know what? I'd like to live in Europe. And I've lived in different places in Eastern Europe. Right now, I'm spending some time in Dublin. An amazing place, obviously much more expensive, but I've always loved Ireland and the Irish people for 15 years. And eventually, I want to pop into Latin America. So, when you're in the middle stretch of this, I think a trifecta method is very good. So you say, I'm going to have a home in Kuala Lumpur or Singapore or Bangkok or Bali or whatever. I'm going to spend 4 months there. Potentially, I can even do that as a tourist if I'm an American or Canadian or what have you, and I can spend 90 days in Malaysia, and I'll come twice in a year. They'll probably let me do that. I don't have to, get an investment visa. Then I go to Colombia or Mexico, right? Mexico is 6 months. They may not give you 6 months anymore, but it's been 6 months. You can stay. That might be a tourist visa, or you just get a residence permit. It's not expensive. And then you pick somewhere in Europe. There's plenty of self-sufficient visas, digital nomad visas, et cetera, that you can live in Europe. But the idea was when you want a little bit of everything, and by happenstance, it happens to be relatively tax friendly because Colombia doesn't tax people who live there for 4 months a year. That's a good way to do it when you're not sure what you want to do. Now, you can modify that and say, hey, Mexico is good for a month or two, put more emphasis on Asia. You can, adjust it as you go, but it's basically saying, I want 3 places that I have a presence in. And it could be for personal reasons. And it could be, hey, I've got an office somewhere and I need to pop in.
One thing I found very interesting when I was reading your book, The Nomad Capitalist, is this idea that, it's not a great idea to have your base in somewhere like the US or Canada or the UK, just because life is more restrictive, right? There's more taxes. It's a little bit more difficult, et cetera. But I also noticed that the caveat seems to be that a lot of these other countries, over time, they also tend to get more restrictive too. So part of the issue I kept on seeing is you'd say things, and I think you just said this here, is like, well, you can live there 4 months or 6 months, but it's getting harder to do that, et cetera, et cetera. If you are more of kind of the settled type and you can buy into this idea of, okay, I'm going to leave the United States because I was born here, but it's kind of restrictive. I'm going to set up something like this trifecta strategy. Is it possible that you will find over time the rules in those places get more restrictive? And is that something that you work into your plan, this idea that, okay,
Yeah.
I may have to continue moving or continue readjusting that trifecta strategy?
Well, I think that people have misunderstood this at times as if, oh, you're always going to be running. I don't think I'm running from anything, right? If I want to live in one place, and I think maybe over time I will be more focused on one place. For me, it was a matter of I wanted to spend time in different places. And the same as when I left the US, I didn't entirely understand how it worked. I said, oh, where do I pay taxes if I'm not living here? All right. And so it kind of said, oh, okay, I can't escape the US tax net, but I can use the foreign earned income exclusion. I can set up a foreign company and I can kind of put those two together. And I paid under $10,000 and many years zero legally. I followed all the rules, and that's what I paid because I was never in the United States. There were some restrictions on that I'm no longer subject to, but I was paying very little because I wasn't living in the U.S. I wasn't using the schools, the roads, the things that you're supposed to pay for. Um, and so if I wanted to live in one place, I would have. There are plenty of places for the person who wants to be settled that are tax-free, like a UAE, Dubai, that are territorial tax, like a Malaysia or a Panama, where you only pay tax on local income, like a job or local investments, not foreign income. There are places where you pay a lump sum, like Italy, 100,000 euros, and then they leave you alone. Switzerland had that first. There's places that are non-dom. You pay only on the money you bring into the country. And so the more you make and the less you live on, I'm a pretty frugal guy. You can make $1 million and live on 100 grand. You can do a pretty good job in some of these places, and you could do that if you don't want to travel. So I think that for me, it's a question of what lifestyle do you want and what's your process. I think that for me, the adventure was worth it. I met a lot of people, found a lot of interesting deals. I think you may become more sedentary as time goes on, to the point of countries changing. I mean, Jim Rogers, legendary investor, said, the wise man would live in London in 1800. New York in 1900, and Asia, maybe Singapore in 2000. Places change. If you look at the index of economic freedom, there's 5 or 6 countries that were communist in your lifetime that now have more economic freedom than the United States. Maybe by the time, we're not here anymore, something will change again. But the nomad refers to the nomads on the steppe. They go with the herd, right? I mean, why do we just sit there and when things start to suck, keep sitting there? Right? I mean, maybe things suck in 5 years, maybe they suck in 100 years, right? But I mean, let's not sit and suck.
So one of the ways to protect yourself from sitting in suck is this idea of location diversity, which I think the Nomad Capitalist is a perfect example of how you can set up some diversity in your life. We always talk about investment diversity or business diversity, but diversification in a sense when it comes to location too also makes a big difference. One of the things you argue for is not just living in other countries, but having a passport or becoming citizens of some of these countries. How many passports do you own currently?
It's about 5 passports. You never own your own passports. The government owns your passports, and that's why you need more than one. If they don't like you, they can take it back. You're grounded.
Tell me where. So is having a passport the same thing as being a citizen of a country?
So a citizen's entitled to apply for a passport, all right? And you talk about restrictions. I mean, there's Western politicians in the UK or Canada. Justin Trudeau was saying, hey, if you're in that truckers protest, maybe we'll, put the scarlet letter on your passport. But they can do that. And so obviously, if you're living in Canada, you're a Canadian. They don't view you as all the different citizenships. You're Canadian. But once you get out of Canada or the US or wherever you're from, then you can take advantage. And so from a travel perspective, listen, I always advise full compliance. I'm a guy, I don't want to get in trouble anywhere. I always file the tax returns. I always did everything. But I also know that the government makes mistakes. One time they thought I didn't pay my taxes. They cashed my check. They just didn't realize they cashed my check. And then they started, giving me a hard time. And I just fight them and show them I paid them. So that kind of thing could happen. And they could suspend your passport because there was a mistake, that kind of thing. So I advise full compliance, but I also realize things can change. Australians couldn't leave or enter their own country during the pandemic. That's in literal violation of all the international law and all the charters they talk about at the UN, that anyone's able to leave their own country and return to their own country. So on top of having that protection, having a citizenship means it's the ultimate ability to live there. Asian countries, for example, don't really give out citizenship. They don't allow dual citizenship generally. I'm never going to become Malaysian. I can live here as a resident. I think they'll be very generous to let me, let people keep living here for decades to come because they're very open. But if you want to lock down the most secure way to live, you can get a passport through your family tree. Maybe it's in Europe. Maybe you're Italian. Now you can live anywhere in Europe. Now you've got, close to 30 countries that when something happens, you want to lower your taxes, there's a black swan event, one of them closes down, who knows what happens? You've got a lot more options, and Europe is great in that regard. The Caribbean, you can donate your way to a passport, get it in a matter of months. Now you've got 6 different countries you can live in. So if you're an American, you can live in one country. Now suddenly you're getting many more countries that basically have to take you in. And who knows what could happen that you'd want to go somewhere else. So having a residence permit gets you in, but having a citizenship makes it permanent. And you get the passport to travel on.
Yeah, interestingly enough, you are a U.S. citizen. You can live in one country, but you can travel to almost everywhere. Whereas one thing you were talking about at the beginning of this conversation, when you have your meetups, you do them in some place like Mexico instead of the United States. Yeah. The other way around isn't necessarily the same. When you're a citizen of other countries, you can't necessarily travel to as many countries. Is that part of the reason why you ended up having 5 passports?
I think I believe in the diversification. If I'm being honest, on the personal level, there's probably a sense of me, particularly in the countries that I spent time in and got the passport, there was a sense of longing for a home. All right. I don't know that St. Lucia, I got the St. Lucia passport. A lot of Americans have followed me on that, and I think they don't realize why I got it. I don't advise most Americans probably shouldn't get St. Lucia, but that's the one of the 5 in the Caribbean that I got. I don't know that I ever looked at that as this is going to be my new home because I don't go to St. Lucia. But some of the other ones I think filled an emotional need as well as a diversification need, and I've made friends in some of those countries, and that feels nice. Certainly having what I call a passport portfolio of lesser quality passports is very good. One of the passports I have, it's been one of the best growing passports in the world in terms of adding countries. It's now a very good travel document. However, if you follow my model and you don't happen to have an Italian great-grandparent or an Irish grandparent where you can get that European passport by descent, you're going to be kept out of the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and maybe a few other countries where you could easily get a visa, Morocco or something. So that's why a lot of high net worth, ultra high net worth folks look at Malta's program. You give them $1 million, and I'm shortening the explanation, but in about 18 months, they'll give you and your family citizenship. And that's the same quality as the US. Plus, you'd have that ability of being an EU citizen to go and live in Ireland, to go and live in Spain, to go and live in Germany. And you could pass that down through the generations. So if you can afford $1 million for citizenship, that's something a lot of people do because they want that high quality passport, especially if they're American and plan on leaving one day. So yeah, I can tell you, we have plenty of people that have renounced U.S. citizenship. They don't want to go to the U.S., but they have 1 or 2 or 3 passports where they can go pretty much everywhere else.
Give me a second here. We are talking to Andrew Henderson. He lives by 5 magic words. Go where you're treated best. He's the managing partner of Nomad Capitalist. We're going to take a short break. I'm Doc G, and this is the Earn and Invest podcast. Any questions before I read us back in?
No, I think we're good. Anything you want me to do?
Nope. Just keep on answering and, we'll continue having a conversation.
Cool.
All right. On 3, 2, 1. Let me reintroduce you. We are talking to Andrew Henderson. He is the managing partner of Nomad Capitalist, which helps people find the best places to live, bank, invest, incorporate, start a business, hire, date, and more. He is also the author of the book Nomad Capitalist. Andrew, let's talk about renouncing your citizenship. Why would someone renounce their citizenship in the United States?
The media talks about people renouncing for tax reasons, and certainly there are people who come to us and they say, hey, I'm tired of paying taxes. Americans are basically the only people. There's a few other occasional situations where, they're the only citizens that have to pay tax no matter where they live. So if you're an American, I had a friend, he went to work in Dubai. He had a job making $1 million a year. He was able to take the foreign earned income exclusion of about $120,000 a year. And the rest he had to pay tax. Everyone else from all around the world that had great jobs in this company he worked in, they live tax-free because Dubai does not have a personal income tax. The UAE does not. He had to pay the United States. Never spent a single day there. and he had to file these, complicated tax returns. And then if he wants to, do a side hustle, it's just very complicated. So I think a lot of people, they look at the complication, especially when they live in a high tax country. The tax systems don't even always match up, and they end up paying a fortune in tax. I mean, there was a transition tax under Donald Trump where people in the UK, it was in the newspapers in the UK, they were doing the worst possible things that no British person would ever do to pay this tax in the US, even though they didn't live there. So people do give it up for that reason. Although I would suggest that if you love the US and you want to visit your grandmother and you want to go over for Sunday dinner, you're probably not giving it up to save any amount of money. So I think it's bureaucracy. I think it's simplicity. I think it's sometimes just tax, although I think it's more about just the paperwork, not the tax itself, because you can reduce the tax to a pretty small number with proper planning, especially if you're an entrepreneur. Some people, they do it to protest policies. I've had people who are Bitcoin and cryptocurrency investors who just think, I'm going to get sucked into a regulatory maelstrom. I don't want anything to do with it. I've had people who can't invest in certain stocks or certain mutual funds or certain crypto deals. And so they're losing money. It's not about the tax. They're happy to pay the tax, but they can't invest in what they want to make money. I have other people who they run businesses in other countries, and the laws of those countries make it very difficult for them to be compliant in the US where they're a citizen. And, occasionally someone just wants to protest the Vietnam War. So I think those are probably the reasons. And I think for me, the reason was just, you know what? I don't really need to go there. I find the policies offensive. I do live in a certain amount of fear having to fill out the paperwork because I want to be compliant. There's so many things to fill out, especially when you have the level of accounts in companies that I do. And I just don't feel like I'm an American. I haven't since I was a teenager. And so why hold that? I mean, for me, it was almost a relief to get rid of it and say, you know what, maybe I could visit one day as a tourist if they want me, but I'll at least go knowing it's not my country.
No, the one
And
thing
there was
that
something,
go ahead.
there was something cathartic about that.
The one thing that became clear after reading your story about renouncement is the one thing you can't do is renounce in order to skip paying taxes on income you've already earned.
Oh, yeah.
Or on 401k plans, et cetera. You actually have to pay, in a sense, to renounce. Is that correct?
Well, there's a fee of $2,350, and they quintupled it a couple of years ago. And before that, it was zero. Right, so it's a very expensive, couple hours they put in there. Listen, they were very professional with me. I have nothing bad to say about them. Very nice people. But on top of that, yeah, I mean, if you've got either a high salary or a net worth over a couple $1 million, or you haven't been filing your taxes while you were a U.S. citizen, any of those could trigger an exit tax. So generally, you can get into tax compliance. You can wait long enough to lower your income that was taxed, in the U.S. If you're overseas, you can fix that. The big one for most people is the net worth. And so they're going to say, hey, listen, whatever assets you have when you renounce, we're going to have an exit tax, which means whatever capital gains you have not paid on yet, we're going to tax you. So we've had guys started a company, it became worth like $100 million. He couldn't afford to renounce because he had proof that his company was worth $100 million because he had investors. He owned 60%, something like that. But guys had bought in with the most recent valuation being $100 million. The company had the money. His shares are worth that, but he doesn't have the cash to say he started it for zero. Now it's $100 million. His share is $60 million. Where's the $15 million in tax he owes? He can't renounce. He has to sell more shares. It just becomes a cycle, right? So, now if he sold the company for $100 million, paid the tax, and just had the cash sitting in the bank, they don't tax you again. But they say whatever you accumulated while you're an American, you can't just leave and not pay us, because if you don't leave, you'll pay us eventually. So if you're going to leave, just pay us now.
So I want to talk about some of the specific financial issues regarding being a nomad capitalist, why some people may pursue this lifestyle. But before we do, let's talk about some other things. There are a slew of topics you talk about in the book that are outside of the financial arena, right? This idea of how difficult it is, for instance, to build relationships and get married as a nomad capitalist. How difficult is it to visit family? Things like how hard is it to get healthcare? I don't want to go through each one specifically, but did you find that these issues that people have with traveling and being outside the United States, did you find that it was easier than you thought it would be?
I think whatever you want to do, whatever you want to set your mind to is easy enough. Um, I think for me, moving out of a country where you're familiar with, you're going to have to be intentional. And so if you live in your hometown and you have 20 or 30 quote unquote friends, you don't have 20 or 30 good friends. I mean, very few people do. And so it forces you to be intentional and make relationships with folks who you only want to make relationships with. Now, the problem in my case, I made a list recently, like, who are my closest friends? And I had about 12 pretty good friends, which I, think for being in my late 30s is a testament to how this can work. But here's the problem. They're in 9 different cities. And so only one of them is in Kuala Lumpur. We don't spend that much time together. So I'm kind of here when I'm in Malaysia. I'm just doing my own thing. I'm using this as my recharging time. I'm getting stuff done. I'm meditating. Maybe someone comes to visit occasionally. But you start to realize, and everyone who's an expat or a nomad says this, you realize who really cares. I've had family, I've had friends. I just had a friend recently. He's gotten on more 12 to 15-hour nonstop flights out of where you're from, Chicago. He's gotten on more of these flights to come and see me in exotic locales over the last 5 or 6 years. That's a good friend. And yet I've had many folks in the US, they don't even talk to me anymore because, oh, you're not here, we can't be friends. So I think that you see who your real friends are and you build good ones.
So let's transition to talk about some of the more financial aspects. I'm just going to run through a series of questions here. Why bank offshore? It's something you spend a lot of time talking about in the book, The Nomad Capitalist.
Higher interest rates, stronger banks. You can hold different currencies. I mean, there's times of strong dollar, there's times of weak dollar. So it gives you more access. If you're in the United States, you want to make an investment overseas, you want to be able to build up euro holdings to be able to get that golden visa or to get that Malta citizenship or to get that second home that you're going to diversify with. You want to buy the euro when it's at parity with the dollar, not when it goes way back up. You can't really do that in the US. There's no bank in the top 50. Maybe there's one some years, but very rarely are there any banks in the United States that are in the top 50 strongest banks in the world. All 3 big banks in Singapore are in the top 15 or so. And so we're Canadian, so we're Australian. They're pretty high up there. But if you're in the US, you're going to get better interest rates, better service, more international exposure overseas.
What does that mean when you say top 50 banks? Because most people, when they think about US banks, they say, well, these are pretty safe. Like, I'm not worried about my money disappearing. We talk about this idea of a run on the bank, but it's not something most people think of as a part of their reality. What does it mean to be a strong bank or to be a top 50 bank?
It means you've got a strong balance sheet. It means you're, not making a bunch of garbage loans. I mean, by the way, there's offshore banks that don't make loans at all. They just hold your money and you pay them a fee and you can wire it out. And some people like that. Listen, there are people in this industry who think the US dollar, listen, it's lost 90% of its purchasing power, but they think it's going to lose another 97% tomorrow. That's ridiculous. They think, some big bank in the US is just going to go out of business. That's ridiculous. But guess what? I mean, the US has more bank failures in a year than pretty much every other country combined. I don't think Austria or Singapore or Andorra, I mean, they've had one bank failure in their entire existence. So if you're with a big bank in the US, maybe you're all right. To some extent, but they're still not as strong as a bank, for example, in Singapore. They still do more risky things. And, if you believe that eventually, look at what happened in Cyprus, look what happened in Poland, look what happened in many countries where times got really bad. And hey, you know what? You're taking a haircut because you're the rich guy. If you've got a big sum of money, that's what they could do. I think politicians in the West don't care about people. If you have more money than you need, they're going to come down on you. They're not going to let the FDIC just come in and, save everybody with a lot of money. They'll save the people with not a lot of money. And if you've got a lot, then you're screwed.
So we've talked about banking and the reason to consider it doing offshore. What about starting a business outside of the United States? I mean, a lot of people grew up feeling like the United States, Silicon Valley, that's a place to start a business. That's a place to be involved in tech. Why look outside the US?
I think it depends on what you want to do. If you're young and you can go to a frontier market, it's like I remember Howard Stern used to talk about every week or every month in radio and records, they had an ad for the radio station in Nome, Alaska. They were desperate. They'll give you whatever you want. And you can build your resume there. You can do that starting a business in some frontier market. And I know people who are in Africa, for example. I mean, they're making money hand over fist because there's no competition. Very simple businesses. So if you're young, that may be something to consider. If you're a bit more seasoned, maybe you're starting some kind of business that lives in the cloud, which is what we have. You don't have to be in any particular location. Why would you start that business in a high tax, high regulation country when you could start it in, again, Dubai or Hong Kong was maybe more popular years ago, or anywhere else, right? The Cayman Islands. And then you get a residence permit to move to Dubai or the Cayman Islands or wherever else. I mean, why would you pay more than you have to? And then I look at people who are, more serious and they have multiple different businesses. And it's nice to diversify that portfolio. So I'm not saying don't do any business in the United States. I have, investments in the US, but I'll tell you, I had real estate investments in the US. They were the hardest things to manage out of all the real estate they own anywhere in the world. Just so, and you'd get a letter, criminal violation, it would say, and you'd open it up. It's like, oh, you didn't cut the grass, send $100. And the lawyer would say, yeah, they try and scare you. I mean, it's just, you don't have it anywhere else in the world.
You mentioned real estate investments, and you've also mentioned crypto, which we don't talk about a lot on this podcast, but there are certain types of investments that are just harder in the United States. What type of investments are better overseas?
Well, I think crypto is one of them. I mean, look at what's happened just in the last few weeks with the SEC. I mean, they basically said we want to go after every crypto as an unregulated security. Listen, I believe capitalism requires ethics, and I can tell you, we've gotten approached by people who've done some unethical stuff. They do some ICO or some pump and dump. I'm not in favor of that. We need ethics in capitalism, or else it doesn't work. But there's plenty of honest projects that it's very hard. Regulation is tough. And so if you live in a country, here's my view on a country like the United States. It's a marketing campaign. It's Coca-Cola. People go into the store. I go in here, they've got salt cola. If there's Coca-Cola and there's salt cola, are you going to ever get the salt cola? You're going to be really adventurous to get the salt cola when Coca-Cola and Pepsi and everything else are next to it. The United States is Coca-Cola. Now, is it the best option? I don't know. Maybe not. But people think it's the best option. And so therefore, the government gets it in its head, hey, people are going to come whatever we do. So we don't need to be innovative. We don't need to be open. What the suckers got. Maybe McDonald's is the better option. The food's not that great. You're not going to die. It's not the worst thing ever. But there's a lot better hamburgers out there. But everyone knows McDonald's doesn't go there. It's a McDonald's and how much they have to innovate, right? And I kind of think that's what it is. If you're doing something innovative, you want to go to a smaller country that's like, oh, this is how we can get on the map. We can be the biggest place for this.
So when it's all said and done, you've now been living this lifestyle for many years. Is there anything you miss about being a U.S. citizen?
I get nostalgic every once in a while. And I think that you start to look at it with rose-colored glasses. I was in the broadcasting industry. I still remember all the different radio stations. I was a real radio junkie, and I occasionally go back and I listen to old air checks of radio stations, and I'll look at houses for sale. But overall, I first of all, you can't live your life with regret. Second of all, no, I think that you leave for a reason, and you have to stick with that reason. For me, I mean, adding something like an Ireland into the mix gives you more of the culture that you're used to, gives you more of the language you're used to. It's nice to go and you get to have more banter with the waiters than you might have somewhere else. So you get more of that home. And you can do that, by the way. I think Ireland is a tremendously underrated place that people can go to, and it's more financially friendly than most people would imagine. So I don't think that I do. I have friends who come and visit me. I talk to friends from there. I mean, you can still buy products from the US. You can still work with US customers. I didn't want to live there before. I didn't feel comfortable. And so we can always, occasionally second guess ourselves, but I think we make decisions for a reason.
I know there's no answer to this question. And as I was reading your book, I was heavily voting here for and cheering for Mexico. But even though I know there's no answer to this one, if you were someone sitting in the United States right now, is there a country that's best if you're thinking about either citizenship somewhere else or looking at permanent residence? Where's the best place to either have a second passport or permanent residence in?
Well, I would look at separating those two potentially, at least until you find a place that you really love, right? So if you say, I go to Ireland and I fall in love with it and I just would love to be a citizen, and that doesn't affect your financial or other, reasons, then you can do that. But I would say get a citizenship for citizenship's sake and live for living's sake. Permanent residence is a technical term. You might have a temporary residence. You might be in Malaysia, there's an MM2H, there's a premium, there's many different terms for residence. I think good places to live. Mexico has, despite the different language, a somewhat similar culture, the service, the vibe, the warmth. That's probably comfortable for a lot of folks. A lot of Americans have moved there. I've been saying it since, Trump was running. If he wins, don't move to Canada, move to Mexico. And people thought it was ridiculous. Now they're all moving. I think Malaysia, if you like Asia, is surprisingly underrated as well. Great healthcare. You mentioned healthcare earlier. Probably one of the best hospitals in the world, just down the street from me, Prince Court Hospital. English speaking, maybe not as well as you would in the US or in Ireland, a little bit different English, amazingly underrated, tax friendly. Ireland has popped on my radar. I think there's some places in Eastern Europe if you want that kind of rugged personal freedom that is gone in the United States these days. Serbia and Georgia and those countries. It depends on what you're looking for. We had during the pandemic people who said, I don't want to deal with any of this pandemic stuff. I want nothing to do with it. And then if they added in tax savings, then it became a pretty short list of places. But it depends on what you're looking for. Again, Ireland and Mexico are very different places, but they both can be very good. And I would say you're not going to get Irish citizenship unless you've got an Irish grandparent. You're not going to get Mexican citizenship until you live there for a certain period of time. You're never going to get Malaysian citizenship, but you can get a Caribbean citizenship. That's probably the cheapest, easiest way to do it. And then Malaysia doesn't care if you're American or St. Lucian.
Who is this lifestyle bad for? I mean, there obviously, as I'm reading the book, as I'm listening to you, there's a definite archetype of a person who I could see doing this. Who do you think would not do well with this lifestyle?
We had a gentleman once. He was a young guy, and he just couldn't get over the fact. I mean, he did go to a Sunday dinner every week with his grandma. I talked to my grandma, and I probably talked to her more than most people in our family because we've got a very Protestant family. We're not super close, but we talk on Facebook. And she likes that. He couldn't do it because he really needed that up close and personal thing. He just couldn't imagine not doing that. I would push back on who can't do it. I don't have kids, but I look at it and I say, to me, a lot of people with kids use the kids as an excuse. I know plenty of people who have kids. Again, you don't have to travel all around the world. Even then, I know people who've given birth overseas to get their kids a second citizenship at birth. You give birth in Costa Rica or Mexico or Brazil, and you get citizenship for the kid by default. And they travel, and it works, and they homeschool. So if you're someone who likes to homeschool, that can work. I mean, I suppose if you just believe in the status quo and you said, my kids need to go to this school, I still think you can find a great international school anywhere in the world. But if you're just so addicted to, this is how my family did it, my parents did it, my grandparents did it, we have to go to the same school. I hear Warren Buffett, whom I love, all of his kids, they all graduated from the same high school in Omaha, Nebraska. If you have some fantasy about that, obviously this ain't working. But for me, I think it's about saying what used to work may not be what works now. And I'll tell you what I've been really ruminating on recently is you can't have romance. When I tell people Dublin, Ireland, they say, but the weather's terrible. I said, first of all, I've had enough good weather. I'd like to wear some of my suits that my great tailor made me. But you know what? Spain sounds nice. A lot of the wives, they all want to go to Spain. You can't get anything done in Spain. So the romance of Spain or Italy wears off. I don't chase romance at this point. And I think that the romance of let's all go to the same high school, what does that do for you? Right? I think I don't know who it's not for because any excuse. I mean, I think this is what makes an entrepreneur. Oh, I can't do it because I have kids. Wait a second. Lots of kids live overseas. Lots of kids live in other countries. They go to school. What if you're a diplomat? What do? You travel every 3 or 4 years. You move somewhere new, sometimes to some pretty crazy places. I think pretty much anyone can do it if they want to. We have 80-year-olds, by the way, doing this.
So, Andrew, I wanted to thank you for coming on the show today. I take a few things from this conversation. One is I think basically fear keeps us from doing some of the things we really want to do in life. And it's a mighty big world out there. And if you are into this concept of go where you are treated best, there's certainly many places outside of the US that you could find in which you could connect with some of that lifestyle you really like. The other part of it is that ultimately, we spend so much time talking about diversifying our income streams and diversifying our assets, but we don't talk a lot about diversifying our location or citizenship or residence. And for many reasons that we didn't talk about, but you laid out in the book, It's not a bad idea to actually diversify, not just in where your income comes from, but where you live and where you belong and where you could, I hate to say, escape to if it ever became necessary. I want to end this episode the way I end every episode by asking you what is up next in your life and where people can find you. So, what is coming up next in your life?
I think I'll continue to hone, as I cede more control of my company to some smart people that we've built up in some very exotic countries and that we've brought in from the US and elsewhere. I think I'll spend less time traveling. I enjoy watching them travel. I enjoy tracking their 15-hour flights and being to a certain extent glad it's no longer me and I'm doing less of that. I think I'll spend a little bit more time in a place like in Ireland, where there's a bit more of a connection with the culture now that the sense of adventure has been very much fulfilled. Probably a little bit less travel. Certainly more, philanthropic stuff. I'm already doing more of that. And just watching people grow what I've built. And so I think that you can approach this however you want. You can do this for 5 years and decide it's not for you. You can build the pieces of this and get the residences, the passports, the bank accounts, and never move and just be ready. And maybe you never have to. So there's no right or wrong way to do it. But for me, it's been different stages. And I think it'll probably be a little bit more settled version in the coming years.
And if people want to learn more about the Nomad Capitalist lifestyle, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
I think the best way to start is to read the book. We recently updated it. So now the new version has my picture on the cover. You can just look on Amazon, Nomad Capitalist. And I think it's a great entree. You could read 2,000 blog posts. You could watch over 2,000 videos we've done, but the book lays it out with some anecdotes and stories you won't find anywhere else to where you understand which parts are for you and which parts may not be. We're on YouTube, 2,000 plus videos. We're on nomadcapitalist.com. You can read articles. And if you would like to work with us and you are a 7 or 8 figure entrepreneur or investor, then we work with a limited number of folks who I think we're probably one of the only companies, if not the only company, that pretty much knows all the programs. They closed one of the golden visas that Americans do recently. And a lot of folks are scrambling because that's all they had to offer. We have 100 residence and citizenship programs we've done. And so how do you make those work together? If you're an American, that's tough because if you make an investment, if you open a bank account, if you open a company, stuff that other people in other countries may not think is a big deal, the IRS, the Treasury, they want to know about that. And so how do you put the 5, 6, 10 different advisors that you need together and have them managed so that you don't have to? That's what we do for those folks.
You've been listening to the Earn and Invest podcast. Andrew Henderson, thank you for coming on today.
It's been a great pleasure.
That's a wrap. All right. I usually keep things good.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I usually keep things running to catch any of kind of our chatter after the show. It's kind of an after show.
All right. Where in Chicago are you?
So I live in Evanston, which is right outside of Chicago, where Northwestern is. And I kind of was born and raised here.
It's like Skokie, right? It's up there.
Skokie is close. Yeah, it's not far at all. Yeah. And so
a friend of mine lives in Naperville. Sorry.
I've definitely considered at least somewhat diversifying by spending some time in Mexico every year, which I think we'll do. Our kids are 18 and 15, so they're getting towards college age. And I'm not really tied to any kind of work because most of what I do is virtual or online. So we're definitely thinking of looking at possible permanent residence or temporary residence there and spending some time there. It's pretty easy in Mexico from what I understand.
The residence, yeah. I'm not quite as involved in the strategic side anymore, but when I kind of stepped into that in November, I mean, they're really cracking down on people going as tourists. I think even Americans, they're like, how long are you coming? It used to be you could live there, come for 6 months, leave for a weekend, come back. Nobody cared. Now they're really, and then imagine, I mean, they don't give my staff a hard time. They kind of give me a hard time because they're like, they think like, I don't know, they think people want to go to the US. They stop a number of people and like kind of interrogate them for like thinking that you want to cross over. So yeah, I think that it's a pretty easy temporary residence to get. And if you're 65, which but like my parents got permanent residence, so they kind of skipped a step.
Yeah. I heard from what I know, and a few people who've done it, that really they're more worried about your net worth than anything else. So if you have a decent net worth, getting permanent residence is actually pretty easy.
Oh, well, Right. Yeah, you can do that. And there's like a real estate way, which I think we found to be kind of confusing and needless. But yeah, I think Latin America is more about income. Asia is more about wealth. But yeah, I guess that permanent residence does have an asset component to it. But generally in Latin America, it's just, do you have monthly income? And it could be a pension. It's pretty easy in most countries to prove.
Yeah. Well, thank you for doing this. It definitely is a lifestyle I think people dream or thought about, but a lot of people haven't pursued. So to hear you lay it out, to read it in the book, and to hear you talk about it makes it seem much more possible and real. And I think there are a lot of people out there who either, have kids and ready to travel, don't have kids, or now are at a little bit of an older age and kind of like, well, what is holding me here? And so it's good to kind of expose people to this idea that it's out there and it's possible and there's some real benefits.
Yeah, and again, you could stair step it. Where in Mexico are you? Are you going to be, Diane?
I don't know. We most recently were in Mexico City and San Miguel de Allende.
Okay.
And we spent a lot of time over the years in Puerto Vallarta and Cancun and Playa del Carmen, but I could see somewhere around Mexico City or San Miguel I really liked, depending on if we want to be more kind of city bound or not.
I mean, I'm a pretty big urban guy. So I like Mexico City a lot. And I'm biased. I mean, I think it's one of the great cities. I mean, San Miguel de Allende is very popular. My parents, they did the retirement thing down in Ajijic on Lake Chapala, but they like Puerto Vallarta
I have
a
some
lot.
friends at Lake Chapala.
Cabo is big now, I guess. I don't know, to live. I mean, that's like a big place now.
Yeah, and another country that I think you seem to be big on, at least from your book, is Colombia. I was recently in Bogota and Villa de Leyva for a conference.
Yeah.
And I liked
really?
it. I was surprised at how much I liked Colombia.
Villa de Leyva, really?
That's
that's a cute place. Yeah.
Yeah, we it was a financial conference. I was a speaker at a financial conference, and we spent a very little time in Bogota and mostly in Villa de Leyva.
Which one was that? That was this one I've heard of?
So it's called Chautauqua. It's a small conference put on by J.L. Collins, where it's about 30 or 40 people. They usually go somewhere either in Europe or in this case in Colombia. And he does 1 or 2 a year. I think he's finished. He's done it for the last 8 to 10 years, but I think they're done. I think this was the last one. And it's one-on-one talks about financial independence and there's usually 3 or 4 speakers, and it's just kind of a week of a mix of talks and good food and a little travel and etc.
Pretty cool. Well, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of good places. I don't know, like Colombia. And listen, go where you're treated best. I mean, you buy an apartment, you get a residence permit. You start a company, you get a residence permit. So it's made it easier to choose, right? I mean, but Latin America is a little chaotic. I'll let you go, but I mean, I have to go in and like renew my permanent residence, and it's only half expired. So they kind of make stuff up as they go in Latin America. But there's a charm to it.
Well, thank you again for doing this. I'll send you a link when this goes live. And usually I'll send you a copy a few days before just so you can take a listen to it. But it'll probably be, I think we're at 2 to 3 weeks or so.
And it's video and audio. You're going to take the video also?
So I've been starting to just throw up. I do a very minor editing on the video, mainly getting rid of the beginning and the end and just throw it up on YouTube. And the audio goes live as part of the podcast.
And we can take clips from that if we wanted to incorporate that, like the renunciation part. We might do a montage.
Yep. And if you remind me or have one of your people remind me, I can just send you the unedited video and you guys can do whatever you want with it. Yeah. I'm completely fine. I mean, just put it out there. Just
credit you.
Just link me somehow so I know that it's out there. But
you're welcome put it on the screen or something.
You're welcome to use it for whatever you want.
Cool. Yeah, well, maybe use it as a montage or a clip or a short. Cool. Well, thanks, man. I'll let you go on with your day, but enjoy your time in Evanston.
Thanks, man. Thanks for coming on.
Ciao.
Take care of yourself.